Hello, welcome to CDI TV. I'm your host, Michael Dieter. We're coming to you live from the Media Lab at University of Warwick. Thanks for joining us in the Northern Hemisphere summer. We're just outside of term. This is our last episode for our second season of CDI TV. I'm very happy to have everybody here, so good morning to you, or afternoon, or good evening in the case of our guests. I'm going to introduce everybody that's joining us today. We've brought together people from both Warwick, University of Warwick, and also joining us from Australia, who have an interest in machine listening. And we're going to talk about what is machine listening, the aesthetics and techniques of machine listening, and hopefully many other topics. I'm going to ask maybe my in-studio guests to, I can briefly introduce you. It's always a bit awkward, I think, having to introduce yourself. So Ian Emsley is here. He's a research software engineer based at the Center for Interdisciplinary Methodologies. I don't have your bio in front of me, but it's fair to say you have an interest in computation and sound.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
And I would say as well, interdisciplinary methods, having been based at SIM. And
yeah, so maybe kind of digital and computational methods on sound, and using sound as a digital and computational method as well.
Great. And we also have Jonathan Skinner, a late addition, but I'm very thankful that you've decided to join us for the stream this morning. You were up late, I understand, watching the World Cup. So, additional props for you coming in. So Jonathan is reader in English and comparative literary studies. You teach eco-criticism and creative writing here at Warwick. And you have an interest in poetry, poetics, eco-criticism, environmental studies, small press culture, also possibly relevant as well for some of our guests in Australia. Sound studies, critical theory and translation. You're the founder and editor of Eco-Poetics, which is a journal that features creative and critical intersections between writing and ecology. And there's a lot of other research interests listed here, but hopefully that's enough yeah. as a start. And you also, obviously I've mentioned sound studies here and in environmental studies, but this is something that I think is relevant for this stream in particular. Something that you're working on at the moment, perhaps.
Always sort of working on field recording and poetry and how they work together. And generatively, potentially. Yeah.
I'm hoping we can learn more about that. And
listening.
Your new work. Listening.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, we were also we were hoping that Naomi Waltham-Smith would join us. Perhaps she'll join us online. Who's also a listening theorist, was based here at University of Warwick for some time, but perhaps she's joining us in chat. I'll monitor chat as well throughout the stream, and people should feel free to ask any questions or make comments there. All right, so now I'm going to introduce our guests who are joining us online. I was just saying that despite being a hybrid stream, we generally have in-studio guests. So only once, maybe twice, we've had guests joining us online, and I hope that the technical setup is working. Because we use OBS and we have this multicam setup with the green screen, this is one of those scenarios where actually perhaps being in Teams or Zoom is much more straightforward technically, but hopefully it's fine. Just signal to me online, our guests, if there's any issues. But I'd like to also introduce James Parker and Sean Dockery from the platform machine listening. I don't know whether you refer to it as a collective or a group. Maybe we'll get into that, the machine listening. I also kind of think of it as machine listening.exposed because of the URL, but I'm looking at the documentation on the website. I don't think .exposed is officially part of the platform title. But just a quick introduction. Sean is an artist and writer whose work explores the politics of technology with a particular emphasis on artificial intelligence and the algorithmic web. Senior lecturer in fine art at Monash University, founding director of Los Angeles nonprofit Telic Arts Exchange, and the initiator of knowledge sharing platforms, the Public School, and arg.org. I don't know whether we'll talk much about arg.org, but it's, I think, a hugely influential project. Certainly, I'm sure, Sean, you meet people all the time who want to talk with you about arg.org. It's funny that I was looking through my emails, and I noticed that it was something like 16 years ago, Sean, that I invited you to participate in an online discussion for the listserv Empire. And I think that's probably the first time that we were in contact, but we've never met in person. We've still not met in person, but now at least we've met.
This is the closest we've got.
Exactly, yeah, even though we've exchanged emails.
Real time.
And there's many people that I think we both worked with, and but we still have not had that opportunity to meet properly. But yeah, that Empire list, I remember it being very stressful organizing it. But somehow the live stream seems less stressful. But welcome, Sean. And we're also joined by James Parker, who is associate professor at Melbourne Law School, works across legal scholarship, art criticism, curation, and production. He is an associate investigator with ADM&S. I'm not exactly sure what ADM&S is, actually, and I haven't Googled it before this, but that's something that Joel Stern, who's also part of the platform, is involved with. So maybe that's something that we could learn about. Former ARC DECRA Fellow, former visiting fellow at the Program for Science, Technology, and Society at the Harvard Kennedy School for Government, is on the advisory board of Earshots, an NGO specializing in audio forensics, and of course part of machine listening.exposed in my mind. So welcome, James. It's great to have you both. It's been a lot of back and forth to try to organize this live stream, so I'm glad we finally managed to find a slot, and hopefully it's all working, and we can have this conversation about your work. I don't know whether you could clarify what is ADM&S?
Yeah, I'm happy to. It's not terribly interesting, I'm afraid. It stands for Automated Decision Making in Society, and it's one of these sort of umbrella organizations founded by a big pot of government grant money, which is sort of, on one level, sort of institutionally not that interesting, and on another level has been a kind of fulcrum or a gathering point for some quite interesting people doing critical work around media, AI, and so on in Australia. So that's not like its main focus, but it's attracted, an interesting crowd, and it has been able to fund some of the things we've been doing and so on. Yeah, but it's a big pot of government money, basically.
Okay. Is that how you met Joel Stern as well? No.
That association goes back a lot longer, and it's kind of an origin story, if you like. Hey, you know what though? But just before I begin, I don't always know how to feel about doing this, but there's something to do with the media relations that are being produced right now. It's something to do with the green screen
Yeah.
and us all talking about IRL and so on. But yeah, it feels important to me right now to do a little brief acknowledgement of country.
Yes.
I don't know how familiar you are with that practice, but yeah, there's something to it. You know, just to say that Joel, Sean, and I work on unceded indigenous land, specifically the land of the Wurundjeri people, and that a treaty has just between Indigenous Victorians in the state of Victoria has just kind of commenced for the first time in Australian legal history. And there's something, yeah, it feels like an interesting moment in terms of legal pluralism, Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal relations in Australia. And it has a lot to do with some of the conversations that I think we might have today about the kind of flattening of the world of sound, or the flattening of the world in general, that a certain kind of approach to machine listening and computation can do. The idea of placelessness, the kind of mobility and scalability of computation. And in a way, like, that's, you know, the condition for our conversation, but it's also the condition for certain forms of ongoing colonialism and so on. And I don't know. I don't always know whether to do this kind of acknowledgement in this context, but somehow it feels appropriate right now. So yeah, we're all working in that context here, and it's sort of a live issue all of the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just jump in that we had some visitors from Australia a few years ago, and it was a perplexing situation for them. They were touring around England giving talks, and they didn't know how to do the land acknowledgement here. Mm-hmm. we had an extended conversation about what is a land acknowledgement in England, and anyways, yeah, so thank you for that.
Yeah, it makes sense to me because we always think of these streams as hybrid, not necessarily placeless, although of course we are participating in the corporate stack with all of its flattening effects. So we're somehow inside of it, but also outside of it. We're interfacing with it.
Right.
I should also say that I'm Australian, and I lived in Melbourne for a long time. I grew up in Melbourne, in fact. I studied at University of Melbourne. And the land acknowledgement, when I was a student, was certainly not commonplace. It's been really heartening to me to see it become a new norm that's practiced. Even though that a lot of that has happened since I've left Australia in the last 20 years or so. But yeah, certainly, you know, I see a lot more researchers, academics, artists, practitioners refer to themselves as based in NARM. I do see that that's on Joel's bio as well. I might just briefly mention that Joel is the third member of Machine Listening, who also is working in obviously the space of looking at sound as a cultural, political, technical practice. And he's a research fellow at RMIT, also was the artistic director of Liquid Architecture for many years, which I, as a student, used to attend in Melbourne. So it was good. That was a nice point of reference to me as well. And I see that Machine Listening has been quite involved with Liquid Architecture, among other festivals, Unsound, and other events around the world. But
that might actually be a good way into a kind of origin story.
Exactly.
Because you asked if ADMS was the context through which we met, but it wasn't. I originally met Joel before Sean moved to Australia, although I was using ARG at the time. When I did an experimental music radio show in Melbourne on an independent radio station, and Joel came on as director of Liquid Architecture, and we talked about some, weird music and so on. He heard about my work on law, sound, and listening. We started to talk. I gave some lectures and so on with Liquid Architecture, and then we ended up curating an exhibition together. It was called Eavesdropping. generated a book, which people can still buy. Here it is. Had some interesting artists involved, and that was the context into which Sean produced a couple of really amazing works in relation to machine listening. Now, the show was kind of trying to hold eavesdropping as a language for law, for thinking about law and listening together. The eavesdropping is like an historical, a very old, like sort of 13th century legal offense in the common law, and sort of gets picked up again with wiretapping and becomes this language for thinking about audio surveillance in the late 19th and 20th century. And so it felt quite fertile when we were doing that work in the mid-teens after Snowden and so on, to be thinking in terms of eavesdropping. And we were thinking about the politics of listening and overhearing and so on, not just in terms of the surveillance framework. And machine listening increasingly felt like an important part of that. And so we worked together with Sean. Sean, as I say, made a couple of fantastic works, and the machine listening project kind of emerged out of that, basically. So we can talk a little bit more about what machine listening is and so on. But that was how we all met, and it was through this eavesdropping framework originally.
Right, and I do see those links on the website. And Sean, at the time you were, so as I said, I knew your work through everything to do with ARG and the public school, but you had at this point started, I think, a track of research around algorithmic aesthetics, algorithmic art, and that's what you were working on when you were involved with the exhibition and event at Liquid Architecture.
I met Joel like prior to that exhibition, actually through his partner Helen, who was working with or making a publisher called Discipline, and she had put on some talks, and I did a talk about I think it was sort of based in work with ARG, but what got me started on thinking about I think the work that was in that exhibition went back to a visit that I'd done to the Facebook data center that was under construction up in Luleå, Sweden. And even that was based in a kind of earlier project where I was trying to upload lots of videos to YouTube. I was uploading monochrome videos, and I had uploaded like tens of thousands of them. And then after a few years, where nothing sort of had happened, I started getting cease and desist letters from Google saying that that those monochrome videos were like licensed material. And so that kind of got my mind thinking about like what's going on those data centers, you know, like what's changing, why is this happening? And so once I started asking those questions, I think that took me down the road of thinking through the kind of like the role of computation, especially situated in the data center. And so that's sort of what led to the projects that James is mentioning that were in that exhibition. But
I think we should, or it would be nice to also talk a little bit about YouTube during this stream, because it I think is an important platform for the development recently of machine listening techniques and data sets and infrastructures, as I understand from reading your research and looking at some of your artistic research. But before we do, maybe we should just define machine listening. So once you've done the eavesdropping project, and then you turned your interests to this topic. And so what is machine listening? I read a few other definitions, or at least terms, in the work that you produced around this topic. There's also, I think, machine hearing. The term audition, I think, is used at times. But Can you offer us just a general working definition to begin with?
I mean, I'd say I'll just jump in and say that probably it didn't start with a definition. It started kind of in search of a definition, or like in search of kind of understanding what machine listening was, right? So, and I personally don't feel entirely comfortable to define machine listening even now, but I think it's important to say, yeah, the project isn't based on a definition of machine listening and kind of as a foundation to work on. I think it was more about kind of having an intuition that it's an emerging field. There are all of those terms that you mentioned kind of being thrown around. There's a developing body of work, you know, like we had seen what Google was doing with audio set, you know, using YouTube for machine learning training and stuff. And so I think machine listening for all of us was an opportunity to come together and start to figure out how to understand what was happening, you know, together and try to build that community. But James, I know you have a really good way of talking about this.
I have a few different threads maybe to tie together. One, because you mentioned ARG and the public school, and I've always slightly thought about our project as having, I mean, I was very inspired by Sean's work and so on, and you might know, or people might be interested to know, that this project began in the context of the pandemic. And so everything was being online and we were not able to meet in person. And so when you mentioned, you know, the website and machine listening exposed, and, you know, we called it a platform, you know, we originally framed it as a curriculum, in fact, for mutual and public learning. And that would take place on this platform, on this website. And so we compiled libraries of materials which were made freely available, you know, using some of Sean's experience there. And we recorded interviews and put them all up on the web. And the whole point really, or the way I think about it now, was to try and work out together what machine listening was, and to try and turn machine listening into an object of scrutiny in the humanities. Because as you say, the term already existed in certain ways, and there are many other versions. And there were already some people doing critical work in the humanities on machine listening, but not terribly many. And so it was like, well, if we start doing this work in public, online, you know, we organized a whole bunch of, you know, experimental Zoom sessions and so on. And some of it we did with Unsound and other festival contexts and things like that. But it was like, well, how will we, let's study this together in public and try and work out what this object is. So that's one way of thinking about it that does connect to some of what we've already said. And another thing worth saying, though, is that despite all of the differences in terminology, and as you said, there's machine listening. I've got a book here. Hang on, this is going to be dramatic. Called Human and Machine Hearing, right? And this guy's got beef with the people who talk about intelligent audio analysis and computer audition and so on. And, you know, there's all this sort of institutional wrangling. But machine listening is an appealing term in certain ways. One of them is its history. And so one of the things we found when we started to, you know, try and study machine listening together is that the term comes from computer music originally. It's coined, at least sort of publicly coined, by this composer at MIT Media Lab, or MIT, called Robert Rowe. And he wrote this book called Interactive Music Systems, which I've got here as well. Machine listening and composing. And so the term then gets taken up by others at MIT as the kind of the name of their lab. And so, yeah, there's something about its origin in music, the fact that it, I like both limbs. I like machine because it suggests a kind of an industrial history that maybe computer, of course, computer has industrial, but there's a history of writing about machines, connecting these computational practices into that longer history of mechanization is important. And listening has this cultural, maybe political edge that like audition or audio analysis and so on tend to obscure or marginalize or diminish in certain ways. So I think that, Joel is an experimental musician, by training. And so the fact that it comes out of music and the fact that probably the musicians involved chose the term because those resonances are present. I think it feels meaningful. It feels like a better word to converge around for humanities scholars, or a phrase to converge around for humanities scholars in some ways than computer audition or something.
Yeah.
There's different ways into that question.
I understand the history of telephony is also important from reading, again, the work that you both have produced on this. And it's a shame that Naomi didn't join us because she's definitely one of those interdisciplinary but humanities scholars who's focused on the politics of listening. And of course, there's been quite some work on that. And as you say, that can get carried into a term like that. I wanted to bring, though, my other two in-studio guests in, maybe around this term, to just invite Ian and Jonathan as well to maybe reflect on. I don't know whether machine listening is a term that you've encountered prior to this live stream, or at least I'm sure that what it refers to, you have your work is intersected with in different ways. So I'll just invite you maybe to how have you encountered machine listening? What does that term mean for you in your own research and practice?
Ian, do you want to lead?
So before I joined SIM, I worked at Warwick at at Oxford, at another interdisciplinary research centre, and I worked with a lot of digital musicologists who were kind of doing machine listening about 10 years ago, and work around it with the whole music information recognition system. So I kind of sat on the edge of systems. I ended up kind of modelling other things with them. But I think I started coming into it a lot more when I was doing the history chapter of my thesis and going back and just thinking about the history of also kind of recording. So you have Bell trying to do like the early phone recording systems back 20s and 30s using simple wire systems to do that until the technology kind of caught up, and then obviously Bell and the phone freaks and Captain Crunch, and essentially having systems that sat there in the background and listened for timings to actually track if somebody was using the system or not, and whether that was necessarily legal, which I think was a long kind of running problem. But I think I've just come back. I think certainly post-pandemic, it's come a lot more in my mind that something to look at. It feels a lot more prevalent. There are deliberate corporate decisions to do certain kind of recordings and stream behind, but I think also accidental ones that are certainly in, I think, perhaps accidental, that kind of James was talking about, some of the ecological, environmental sensing that happens. I'll stop rambling and pass on.
No, great. I think because you're making a few additional connections that I think we can pick up on, not just that history of telephony, but it seems as if machine listening is increasingly being applied to the context of the climate crisis, which is also something that I know that, James, you've written about. But I think it also connects with some of your work, Jonathan, on eco-criticism, that context of environmental sensing and listening, machine listening.
Yeah, I mean, I first heard the term machine listening from Ian, actually, but I instantly recognized it is sort of another way of describing stuff that I'd been involved with for some time, going all the way back to the turn of the millennium when I was writing my PhD in sort of a practice-led, in some ways practice-led investigation of poetics in relation to ecology, so eco-poetics, and procrastinating the writing of said PhD entailed walking around a kind of post-industrial brownfield in South Buffalo with a digital mini disc recorder, which those had sort of come online as a consumer grade item at the time, and I got obsessed with recording, field recording, using the mini discs, and I was sort of interested in the fact that I was listening to them, but I stopped auditing my recordings at a certain point. But I was always recording. So what did the fact of pressing play mean? Why, how did that change my stance? And anyway, it was part of a kind of a project of site-based poetics and what I call eco-poetics again, or sort of an expanded poetics, where taking poetry back to its root sense of all of making, but also expanding the site of poetry beyond, text, bookshop to the field, as it were. So the recordings did become a part of my compositional process, in particular through the use of spectrograms, like really basic spectrograms that I can't even remember what software platform it was, but I generated these spectrograms, which I then used to model lines of poetry. So I was working with, the visualization of sound, and that of course is a kind of machine listening. Anyways, 10 years later, I ended up at Cornell with the group of scholars focused on sound, and one of my projects there was to wander over to the Lab of Ornithology. I'm like a Cornell, I have to go to the Lab of Ornithology, so I wanted to sort of investigate what does a sound lab sound like. So I sort of went in there with this Latourian project to interview engineers, acoustic ecologists, ornithologists, and asked them about the sounds that they were collecting in the Macaulay Archive of Natural Sounds, which is the world's largest archive of animal vocalizations. So I interviewed staff at the Lab of Ornithology about their favorite sounds and why. And at the time they had their the bioacoustics research project. They were initiating their whale listening project, also the elephant listening project, which I know comes up in.
What year was this?
This was 2010. So yeah, I interviewed Katie Payne, who's involved with the whale listening project.
Wow. Cool.
And there's a podcast. It's on Sounding Out blog called Animal Transcriptions. Anyways, what came up again and again on the part of the scientists and sound engineers and acoustic ecologists was the fact that they were looking at sound more than listening to it. One of their projects was the elephant listening project entailed scanning large, huge stretches of recording of the forest in Central Africa, but they weren't studying elephant vocalizations per se. They were looking for the vertical mark of a poacher's rifle shot, so they could identify the presence of poachers. Similarly, for the whale listening project in the Massachusetts Bay, they were looking for the kind of Nike strike that was indicating the presence of northern right whales, an endangered population. There's around 200 individuals left. They could then alert the captains on bridges of ships in real time, to the presence of whales, so they could slow down the oil tanker and hopefully avert a ship strike. That has all been automated now, as you know. And but at the time they were actually sitting in this space, they called it the Pentagon, because there were 5 of them sitting in front of monitors, just scanning spectrograms. So it was this weird transitional moment. In fact, I interviewed Ashak Rahman, who's, I think he's one of the engineers who developed Merlin, the Merlin app. So anyways, that's kind of my, I was pretty involved with machine listening before I knew what it
What it was.
what the term was. I I think the debate about what to call it is an interesting one, because it's certainly machine hearing in some ways. The listening is a practice.
Yeah.
Human practice.
I think there's a lot of so this area of bioacoustics that I was kind of alluding to before. It's something we should talk about. But just before we do, I'll just very quickly offer my 2 cents of like how I became. Well, I was aware of the work of machine listening, but why I really wanted to speak with James, Joel, and Sean was because of doing this hybrid stream, and we decided to do some transcriptions. And I think we'd become aware that transcription had been increasingly sort of ambiently deployed as a service, as something we encounter more and more at university, in workplaces. It's part, of course, of the Teams software that we use for work meetings. So we're sort of aware that transcription had just become this thing. It's on YouTube, of course, as well. You can select for auto transcription. So we wanted to explore, one of the ways that we think about doing the streams is as publishing. And so we were inspired by the expanded publishing research project that Institute of Network Cultures was involved with, among other centers. And in doing that, we sort of came right up against all the politics of transcription as it's folded into AI and machine listening. So that's also part of the motivation, I think, to organize this session for us. But I wanted to ask Sean and James about a more kind of general question. So I think part for me, the context of machine listening, you'll see that for this stream I added platformisation as a term, because that's something that I've spent quite some time thinking about and working on. I've mentioned YouTube already as a platform we use for this streaming that's also been important for the development of machine listening. But I wanted to ask you about sort of what changes when we place an emphasis on sound and on listening in relation to these regimes of platformization and datafication. Because it seems to me that there's been such an emphasis on the visual in relation to those critical topics as a way in. And even with that as a way in, a lot of the theories of what happens to the visual is that it kind of breaks down. It becomes something quite other to how it's been historically understood. The image is sort of invisual, is one term, for instance, that's used by Anna Munster and Adrian Mackenzie. But I wanted to ask, like, if we move away from that as a starting point, the image, the visual, we begin instead with sound and listening. Does that allow us to understand those topics differently? Platformization, datafication, and the politics of AI?
Sean, I can't see you, so
No.
you have to jump in if you're like raising your eyebrow like you want to speak.
No, something really funny happened, which is I lost the thread of the question a little bit, which is not about the question. It's about that I started watching the live stream, and then the sound and image peeled off from each other because the image is about 30 seconds behind the sound.
I warned you not to do that.
And I just got disoriented. So James,
yeah.
I think I need you to.
So yeah, the question is, like, if we begin with sound and listening and machine listening, does that allow us to ask different kinds of questions about, for instance, datafication, platforms? We could also use a term like surveillance capitalism, certainly the politics of AI, sort of these big topics. You mentioned extractivism a lot in your work. There's obviously a lot of people working with those concepts, but if we start from machine listening and sound, as a way into them, does that give us sort of different questions, or we sort of understand the issues in a new way? Or
can I have a crack at this then, Sean?
But
I guess that my first observation is that, because I've been working on sound and listening for a long time now, basically my whole career. So my reflex is always to say, well, maybe, but you have to be careful about what you mean by sound and listening, and it's very important not to presume that you know what sound and listening are already when you approach something like machine listening, and that you're going to find the same thing there. And likewise, that you're going to see something that, that the differences between listening and vision are as pronounced as you might assume them to be in other contexts. In other words, I just would want to sort of bracket the question in a certain way, in a very annoying academic way. So for example, like machine listening is not really, so if we approach machine listening with listening in mind, it doesn't really emerge as like, or sound and listening in mind, it doesn't really emerge as a thing until the 1990s. They're very separate. You have speech recognition. For the whole history of machine learning, it's speech recognition and music. That's like, those are the two fields. And so you couldn't find a field of machine listening. It doesn't exist. But what you would find is that speech recognition and then later transcription, since you mention it, are really important in the development of the history of machine learning in general, or and AI in general. So speech recognition is there right from the beginning. As soon as anybody is doing any work on, on AI, they're doing it with speech recognition. And some of the most important early experiments in statistical methods in AI happen at IBM in their sort of pioneering work on transcription technologies, where they're attempting effectively to automate secretarial labor. And so the idea that we have, been very focused on vision and stuff already begins to get undercut if you look at that history, because speech recognition is there from the beginning, but it's not really a way of thinking about, they're not really concerned with sound in general. One of the main problems with those early systems is that they basically only work in lab conditions. Even a quiet study in the home is not really good enough. And so you start to get a concern with the auditory scene emerging in like the 1990s. And so there's this kind of this broadening out of the object of research towards speech in sound. And then you start to get people working a lot with computer music experts who are saying, well, we can pick out different lines in contrapuntal music, and that ability to stream, to experience sound as different streams, that could be really important. And you get this cross filtration between the speech recognition and the music people, and then this broader field of kind of machine learning, sometimes computational auditory scene analysis is kind of one of the subfields. So in other words, the object of studying sound and listening in machine listening really changes across its history. So it's just to say that, like, you can't go looking for the object sound or listening and expect to find it necessarily. It emerges out of those institutional histories and practices. And it turns out that stuff like machine listening has been more important to the history of machine learning probably than people think. But it's a very useful crutch for academics in this field. Like, I've been to some machine listening-ish conferences, and they're always saying, "Oh, the money goes. We're inconsequential, us little old machine listening people, us little old audio people, the big money's in the computer vision and so on. All the while, they're building systems that are hugely consequential. And I do feel like sometimes I feel like it's an alibi for doing big things while pretending that the real action is elsewhere. I don't think it's cynical, but I do think that's part of what's going on sometimes. There's a very common story. Now, I haven't answered the platform question exactly, but just to say that, like, you have to be careful about assuming you know what sound and listening are when you start a conversation like that.
You're right. That is the academic response, but it's a good one, I think.
Can I also add? Oh,
well, it's something that also doing these streams, I became intrigued by the history of video and video theory, which has similar problematics at the heart of it. Like, what is video a medium? And most of the answers are no. At best, it's a kind of configuration. And I imagine you could say the same thing about machine listening, that it's a configuration that also changes historically over time. I don't know whether I felt like.
Could I just add to something?
Yeah,
what
of
James
course.
said? Yeah. I mean, it's maybe a bit prosaic, and I don't really have many sort of anything to say on like general claims about listening or something. But I do think like machine listening is sort of useful for us, maybe in terms of like methods or ways of working or something like that. Just in that, I think like James, Joel, and I all come together with a background in music of some sort, whether it's playing or radio or just listening to it a lot or music criticism. And I just think that like it kind of opens the door to those bits of our past. And I'm just thinking about music, like has certain forms of like collaboration and production that I think we've drawn on in the work. And then there's like radio, which sets up certain forms of kind of relations and community. And I don't know, improvisation also is, come up in the work in ways that it normally doesn't. So I think there's something about machine listening which opens the door to certain ways of working that I think sometimes aren't immediately available to me because for various reasons. So in some ways, the kind of like orienting around a term like that is sort of like generative when it comes to working. And then I also think that there are specific like materials or technologies or like perspectives that like by using the term, like it becomes a kind of lens and just makes me personally a bit more attentive to certain things in the world than I would be sort of without it. And so I'm thinking like microphones. Like I'm always kind of looking around for microphones. We're often talking about microphones and how many there are in devices, where are they? Smart speakers and voice assistants obviously is like a big part of this world, or even with something we'll probably talk about later, but Ego 4D and smart glasses, you think of this as primarily a visual kind of technology, but because of the history of the conversation we've been having and the lens that we're using, are thinking a lot about the multiple microphones that are embedded in those and the importance of voice assistance within the smart glasses. So I think, to build on everything James said, and also it still kind of functions as a generative lens in certain ways.
You were telling me you're working on some similar kinds of questions around microphones.
Well, yeah, I kind of wanted to go back and sort of ask maybe a little bit more of what is the machinic, what do we mean by machine? And another way to put that would be like, is a microphone a machine? I mean, sort of my perspective comes from thinking about like putting a microphone in the so-called field, and instantly, that puts that in the field into question. Like, what is a field? Does a microphone configure the field? Of course, we know when microphones shape depending what kind of mic you're using and how you point it and where you place it. The field changes considerably, so they're not necessarily separate things. But there is this kind of principle of acousmatic sound, right? Behind the microphone. It goes all the way back to Pythagoras, who supposedly sat behind a screen so that his pupils, would focus on what he was saying and not be distracted by looking at him, which for me has always highlighted the political dimension of acousmatic, of a certain kind of listening or imposed sonic situation. So the microphone, I've been very interested in the politics of the microphone, that it's not a neutral thing, but even when there's no one present. What are the kind of social and ecological, ecosocial dimensions of that acousmatic situation, which is about a kind of disconnected connection with the environment, or schizophrenia is another term we use. So I was kind of wondering, is that a machinic situation, or is the machinic, does it involve the network and computation and algorithms, and like the one other term I'll throw out there is sounding, and I always like the dual valences of sounding as making a sound, but also sounding the depth, through sonar, and or like Andy Hildebrandt's discovery of auto-tune, through sort of sounding for the oil, for the extraction, for the petroleum industry, developing technology for sounding the prospects of the seafloor for oil extraction. So and then cross-species sounding, with sonar and echolocation. So listening is never just a matter of being quiet. In fact, you have to kind of make noise to listen. So I just throw those two things out, but just kind of maybe ask you guys, what is the machinic? You said this emerges in the 90s, so I'm assuming computation is an important part of it.
Sorry, I was trying to get at the idea that machine listening as a field concerned with sound in general emerges in the 90s.
Okay. Yeah.
So when I say, your point is exactly right. The machine in machine listening is extremely ambiguous, and everybody means something. And of course, a microphone is a machine in a certain kind of way, and in a way that, what machine listening is the question, not the answer. Machine listening describes a field of concern or a field of practice, not a technology. Like when Robert Rowe coins machine listening, he's talking about rule-based AI. Like there's literally a machine listener, which is a module within his interactive computer music system that does certain things according to certain rules which he's programmed. Whereas later, and again in the 90s, when it starts to become, a broader sort of it starts to refer to the application of AI to sound in general, to the soundscape. But then there's millions of different techniques. So when we say machine, some of the most of the time early on, they're doing spectrographic analysis, right? So is it really listening and so on? It is a version of computer vision. But then there are more recent systems that are working directly on audio. And now there's multimodal systems in which the distinction between audio and vision and image sort of breaks down, and other sensory modalities as well. So no, I don't have an answer to the question, except that I think it's, on one level we have to treat it just as a term, like a hype term, a way of describing a thing that most people are not very careful about, and that makes it mobile and useful in certain ways because we can have a conversation together. But I think one of the things that Sean and I and Joel always try to do is, maybe not on the website in the most flippant writing we do, but is to refer to try and follow specific systems. And one of the reasons we've become very interested in data sets, looking at data sets, specific ones, and it gives us a kind of something really concrete to hold on to. And I mean, you can tell that I have an historical orientation increasingly, and I do think it's important to try and be as specific as possible. Like, which algorithm are we talking about? What was it trained on? You know, when are we talking about just signal processing techniques that have got nothing to do, you know, with AI at all? And when are they converging? When is something that used to be done by X process now being done by machine learning? Why, you know? So the machinicness changes, basically.
Could I ask a follow-up question?
Of course,
Which is
yeah. Just
so
jump
in that emergence of machine listening essay, which was really helpful, which Sean, you co-authored with James, there seems like there's a shift from rule-based to probabilistic, you know, which is, you know, in the development of AI, that's also a still active difference, you know, in terms of like potential generative AI and, you know, which system will it be using. But is that a critical shift from, one question is that a critical distinction that we should be mindful of when we're talking about machine listening between rule-based and probabilistic? And then also, where do we draw the line between a generative kind of listening, generative AI also, and a more kind of you know,
Flattening?
Well, yeah, it's sort of amassing of data, you know, a kind of cumulative, you know,
Extractive.
primitive, yeah, accumulation of data.
Yeah, extractive flattening.
Yeah, extractive flattening.
Sean, do you have a thought? Or
No, I don't.
maybe I'll just say one quick thing then. Why does that matter? I think it has political and structural consequences, the shift from rule-based to machine learning. If you were to think about bioacoustics, for example, you know, we're in a situation now where the field is just putting as many microphones as they can, basically, in as many places as possible. And that's because that kind of data can be processed and used to train systems at scale and at speed. And so that has certain kinds of downstream effects. I mean, it makes certain kinds of companies more powerful. All of these bioacoustics organizations need to partner now with, you know, massive tech companies with data processing abilities at scale. They're mostly sort of offering that for free at the moment, or on sort of as part of a kind of a greenwashing deal or something. And, you know, if we think about outside of bioacoustics, you know, the datification of everything is partly a response to the emergence of machine learning. Not exactly, but it produces certain kinds of incentives about where you put microphones, why you put them there, what you ask them to do, and so on. So I don't know if that's a full answer, but I do think that shift produces certain kinds of consequences for big tech companies and capital.
Yeah, I'm glad that you bring up the embedding of microphones into the environment, because I was quite struck reading your essay, The Planetization of Machine Listening. It's a great essay, so I recommend it for anybody who's also tuning in. I was wondering about these, what you end up calling medial affordances, or maybe it's mediological affordances of microphones, but also maybe just the we could say capture, extraction, production of sonic data. Because I guess if we take up Sean's point that machine listening can kind of direct your attention to particular devices, particular affordances, I think James, you have this kind of list of qualities that is used in bioacoustics that sort of lend themselves to, they're advantageous for the large scale collection of data. So for instance, that microphones are relatively cheap to produce and install, especially if they're damaged or need to be replaced. That they can be discretely placed, so they can be quite small. That they're omnidirectional, so you have this particular capture of the sonic environment, the sound environment that's possible. That also you're able to capture sounds in a way that capturing images, you're dealing with light conditions that can be really challenging, whereas sound can run in day and night in a wide range of environments. So I thought that was quite useful when I was reading that, to try to understand, like, as you say, what the consequences are for the sort of downstream mass capture of an environment sonically through these different devices. More of a comment, it's not really a question, but I don't know whether you have a response, but it's also...
I do have a response.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Because what's really interesting about that, so thanks, I'm glad that you enjoyed the paper. So you mentioned affordances and so these are media theory words, right? Mm-hmm. And specifically the media theory that I was thinking with was Mark Andreevich's work. I don't know if people know Mark Andreevich, but he talks about the biases of automation. He's drawing on all sorts of media theory, and he's trying to get away from technological determinism, but holding on to the fact that sort of under capital and so on, certain technologies might lean in certain directions. They might be better for doing certain kinds of things while certain kinds of background conditions are in place. And so I've been reading that, I was quite interested. And then I was reading all these bioacoustics papers, and all the scientists are saying the same thing. So that's not me pointing that stuff out. That's all of the bioacoustic experts. There's in every paper, there's where people are advocating or describing this, all of these new systems and trying to scale them up, and the new kinds of analysis and efforts like the Global Library of Underwater Biological Sounds, which is meant to compile as many different data sets of ocean sounds as possible. All of these efforts, they're all talking about what machine listening or what audio and what microphones, what they call passive acoustic monitoring, might offer. It's kind of like a sales pitch. And there was just such an interesting convergence or kind of rhyme between, pretty hardcore media theory and just the points that the scientists are making themselves when they're justifying this work. And yeah, so it's all, there's something about the smallness, the discreteness, we could question all of this in terms, I'm not an essentialist in relation to sound listening, but as we've seen, but that element of sound that you can listen without being seen, that's a very long-standing trope, or that microphones are cheap. What one thread of work is interested in biodegradable microphones, because they think that might be more possible in relation to microphones than cameras, and because microphones are low powered, maybe you could draw power for the microphone from the tree on which it's placed and so on. So yeah, there's a kind of embedded or latent media theory in the thinking of the computer scientists and the bioacousticians who are doing this work.
Could we need to talk about sound, machine sounding as well as machine listening? Because it seems that, also you can sound, the acousmatic principle is that you can sound without being seen. You can make sound without being seen. And I was really intrigued by this, I loved in the paper this, I was intrigued by this concept of open space active noise cancellation. In other words, putting speakers into the environment that would create sounds that would cancel you know, and I realize I need to, for the first time, I finally got some proper noise canceling earbuds that I'd never had before, and it's sort of kind of blown my mind, like how they're working, and also I find it incredibly disturbing, but intriguing, and I really don't understand how they work. But you know, what does that mean to sort of deploy that in an open space and on a planetary scale of kind of a concept of noise cancellation?
I feel like this might be another one for me, Sean.
Sorry.
That's fine. You know, I prefer when you talk, James.
Look,
I mean, I'll keep it
to
brief.
the end of the bioacoustics.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
topic.
all I'll say is that just notice the shift in register maybe between the two conversations we've had. One has been about historical specificity and all this stuff when we're talking about speech recognition and so on. Computer music, this happened in 1990, la la la. And this work, which is much more future oriented and speculative oriented, and the phenomenon I was interested in that paper, and that we've also been interested in some of our art work. We made a piece called Environments 12, which is about a similar set of concerns, is much more to do with like a kind of imaginary or a socio-technical imaginary or political imaginary or something that seems to be coming through in the computer science papers that we're reading. And so that particular anecdote about open space active noise cancellation is in a paper by a chap called Bjorn Schuller, who I think is sort of cross-appointed between a university in London and one in Germany. And it's got this slightly feverish, and I don't mean this in a critical way or a negative way, but like a slightly mad quality. It reads a certain kind of like science fiction. And so there are all of these speculative, he's like, how could we use AI to solve the climate crisis? Well, we could do open space active noise cancellation. And that's not a thing that is exactly happening, but there are very, very small scale examples of people trying to do that, just as there are very small, increasingly. He has another example in the paper where he talks about embedding microphones loudspeakers in natural systems, forests and so on, for warning animals about incoming bushfires in their own language, using machine translation into the language of the, you name it, kookaburra, kangaroo, whatever. And so there's a very fertile imaginary, which is quite interesting, quite odd, may not happen, but tells us something. It's not quite like madcap CEO brain, but there's something about the kind of the desperation or the melancholic desperation or something about seeing this kind of thing pop up in papers. I mean, one thing that is definitely happening is this thing, this phenomenon, acoustic enrichment, where on coral reefs, a British scientist, kind of the pioneer of this guy, Stephen Simpson, I think he's at Bristol maybe, who played the sounds of reefs into dying coral reefs, played the sounds of healthy reefs into dying coral reefs, and found that it attracted more life into the reef. And so that, again, that seems sort of very sort of poignant and melancholy in a certain kind of way. And they even imagine in a project with Google automating that, right? So you would kind of literally retune the reef according to its sort of daily or monthly needs. Again, it's sort of very speculative, but that is something that's now being kind of imagined, and maybe one day it will come.
I mean, something, there's the Promethean mad scientist element, but there's also a question of scale, and that, I want to get over to Sean, but just this sort of, is that part of the problem? Is this and it's extractive capitalism that drives it, of course, which is this sort of almost automatic scaling up to the boundaries of the planet, whereas listening has always, to me, been what's interested me is the intimacy of listening, also of microphones and the technology, which also, in problematic ways as well, the kind of going back to eavesdropping, but but that there's a very different scale at work in the kind of listening that creative practitioners, I think, individual, even collective creative practitioners are interested in, are involved with.
Yeah, this may or may not be a bridge over into some of Sean's work, but I think we'll get there because I do want to ask about some of the more like consumer deployments of machine listening. But just to round off this work on bioacoustics, yeah, I was really intrigued by this project as well, calling in our corals that you've just referred to, James. And I got the impression that at times you had some kind of ambivalence towards it, but ultimately this paper goes in quite a critical direction. And I think elsewhere in an interview, and this might be unfair, so apologies if like to sort of repeat this comment from the interview, but I think you do refer to some of the researchers in the field of bioacoustics as being perhaps politically naive. Part of, I think, the critique is, as you mentioned, drawing on Andreevich's understanding of automation and where these kind of systems lead, where they kind of, what tendencies they have. But I wanted to ask a question about interdisciplinarity in a way, because the machine listening project, the platform, is so interdisciplinary. And I think when I look at the curriculum, when I look at some of the books that you've shown us on stream, you're engaging with so many different domains and bringing it together at this kind of crossroads around this term, machine listening. I just wonder, like, how do both of you think about the interdisciplinary aspects of your project? Do you write some of these papers with a specific kind of audience in mind? When you were writing this critique of some aspects of bioacoustics, were you also engaging with some of these researchers and kind of sharing notes? And are they somebody that you would anticipate reading the planetization of machine listening, and maybe, or is the strategy or tactics of interdisciplinarity for you, does it lie sort of elsewhere than really direct forms of engagement? It's a big question.
It's a really good
sketching out
question.
a few different aspects of it, but I don't know whether you would have a response to that. It might also be relevant for you, Jonathan, as well, given that in the visit you made to the bioacoustics lab at Cornell. But I'll put it to Sean and
I'll just start because I feel like you've been anyway. It was super interesting hearing about the Cornell Bioacoustics Lab, because when we were researching for Environments 12, I remember reading about Katie Payne and the history of spectrograms and, reading those articles and everything. So it would have been really nice to, I should find the interview. But I think that's sort of part of the point of interdisciplinarity around machine listening, that there isn't really a privileged discipline to engage with the topic. So that's one thing to say about it, is that the project is sort of disciplinarily expansive, like sort of necessarily expansive in that way. I think the other thing maybe that jumps to my head is that, like, as an artist, I guess I have a discipline, which is art, but then I also have a history of a lot of other disciplines on my way to that. And then art is sort of famously kind of a bit promiscuous in terms of, what it considers its field of, like it's always getting its nose in other things. Whereas James, I think, probably has a slightly different, like, we're both interested in sort of like going outside of our discipline, I think. But I think that, James, you've mentioned that being in the law faculty, like, also gives you certain, I don't know, it makes you ask certain questions and, want to publish in certain ways at times. So.
And escape publishing in certain ways.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
But I'm just saying you have like, yeah, like maybe your relationship with disciplinarity is like a bit more sort of like fraught or heightened in a way that I think I can escape or elude a little bit more easily.
I definitely feel like we're approaching therapy now.
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's absolutely right because I'm publishing in unusual places. I don't feel exactly comfortable calling myself an artist, even though I have been now for a number of years. We don't need to get into all of that, but I think it's really important, to be honest, having this sense of discomfort. You're quite right that I express some ambivalence in the paper about that project. And it's because I've met some of these scientists, not those exact ones, and they're nice people and they're not the problem. And so what I'm trying to notice in the paper is a disciplinary formation or a kind of a field forming that is clearly coming increasingly into contact with big tech and with capital, where some of the brightest people in bioacoustics are, going and doing internships at Google and everywhere, as they've always done. Bell had these relationships too, and so on. But we're seeing now, the UN is developing biodiversity markets, which would be an equivalent to kind of carbon markets but where you would get biodiversity credits. Well, how do you measure biodiversity? Well, one way you could do it at scale would be machine listening, right? And so when I've been to conferences of machine listening people, they're just not really talking about what it might mean to do that. Like, should we be doing biodiversity markets at scale? Should we be producing the technology and the systems, and what would that to make that possible? What kind of power would that give to tech companies? What form of relation would that involve? What jurisdictions would be required? All of the political and legal questions that give rise to are not front and center. So that's what I mean when I say politically naive, but I don't mean like they're the enemy. I just mean that there are contexts and structures in play which, as somebody with some training in law and critique and the humanities, certain things are more obvious or more front and center in my concerns, and they don't seem to be there. They're not able to be asked in certain ways, which isn't to say that people don't think about them, but they're not a major part of the conversation.
Yeah, I ask it as well because I'm based, like Ian, at the Center for Interdisciplinary Methodologies. So it's something that I've encountered a lot, the sort of politics around interdisciplinarity. I think it could even be phrased that way. But Ian, I wanted to invite you to join if you had any questions, because I think Jonathan and I have been sort of quite dominant so far in the conversation. Did you have anything that you wanted to bring in?
I was going to say, I'm not entirely sure if you can, from my perspective, if you can do this sort of work without being interdisciplinary, because you kind of you start maybe, from my side, like a technical thing, but you end up realizing there are politics, there are kind of political economies around this, political philosophies, and also the ethics and stuff that do come out about either creating data sets or trying to study them, or kind of do that, and then to have that conversation, I think, meaningfully with other people rather than abstracting the idea of sound. And one of the things that in some of the work that I've been kind of sketching out recently is that move away, and it's something I think Sean was saying about the move away from expert systems to AI system machine. Have we moved away from the possibility of sound, in a kind of get there in a sense, into the probability of sound? That's kind of shifted completely, that whatever comes in through the model, because the way machine learning systems are increasingly seems to be working, whatever we're coming out is more of that probability that this is the next sound or the next part of sounds that comes in, and that the models have kind of changed from being within the expert system to just being mathematical models, and has that, I think, shifted the knowability of sound, and also very much, you know, that shift between music and speech and anything that's something else that's sonic, that may or may not be sound, we're not quite sure. Is that something you kind of seen happening? I'm trying to turn it into less of a comment to more of a question, but probably failing.
I think comments are also fine. I don't know whether, though, Sean and James, whether you have anything to pick up on from those observations. There's at least two other topics that I'd like to raise. I know we've been chatting for a while. These streams can sort of become a bit open-ended.
Could I just, I mean, just one thought, just to, I think it is important. I think the question of interdisciplinarity and how one theorizes or imagines or practices interdisciplinary space, for lack of a better term, is really critical. And that's probably the one thread through all of my practice as a poet, but also a poet who's not really comfortable in poetry world, nor do I really fit into disciplinary world of, you know, academic discipline. But what I've been able to observe, including at Cornell, is the incredibly siloed nature of these institutions, and the persistence of the left behind spaces, or the in-between spaces, and that those are privileged spaces, I think, for creative practitioners, you know, where we can move and practice a politics, you know, a kind of listening that's political, that's resistant, that's intimate, that's collective. And there's not enough theorization, there's not enough discourse about these spaces. Like, what, you know, how do we imagine these spaces? How do they persist? How do they resist? How do we make them sort of, I don't want to use the word sustainable because I hate that word, but keep them going. So I just wanted to throw that out. You know,
yeah. And I think, you know, to bring it back to Sean as well, sometimes these spaces are more infrastructural in a way. Mm-hmm. And, you know, arg.org is, I think, a great example of that. You know, of course, focused on arts and humanities, but there was such an array of texts in that shadow library, and people would make these connections between the texts and share their own curricula, and share their own sort of curated lists, recommended readings. And maybe, I don't know whether, Sean, you're able to speak to this, but this is something of your, like, practice. It's something to do with how you approach artistic research, is to be assembling texts, curating texts. It's totally a post-digital way of approaching text. I saw reference in the machine listening platform that this was something that you took to this collaboration as well, that part of the work is to circulate amongst yourselves a whole array of different texts. I just wonder, like, I don't know whether you have any reflections on this as a kind of practice and as a way of fostering interdisciplinarity. Maybe it's a sort of straightforward comment, but
no. I think
you have any reflections on how this has sort of changed, or whether you do this sort of intuitively, or whether you think about it more systematically or theoretically.
Intuitively, systematically. Sorry, I'm the kind of person who likes to think and write, and so I'm not always super comfortable, sort of like speaking in the moment to like a bunch of people. But I'll do my best. And this is a tricky one because it's like something that's gone on for decades. And so ARG, the project you mentioned, started like more than 20 years ago, and it's over now. And I can't talk about how it ended for reasons, but it changed so much in those decades, and the world changed so much in those decades. The internet changed. It was partly a kind of like pragmatic response to a kind of like social situation, which is like the social situation being maybe an educated, sort of group of people who are kind of educated or really enjoy reading or enjoy sort of like the communities that are based around reading things, and then maybe not having a kind of place to do that, but also a technological possibility, which was like the internet at the time sort of allowed for like peer-to-peer types of exchange, and it's sort of like putting those together. And of course that changed because like after a certain amount of time, the shape of the internet changes, and also my sort of relationship to communities of reading practice changes and all that kind of stuff. So it's difficult to talk about because it's a bit of a moving feast. But I agree with Jonathan's point that like, fostering these spaces that are kind of maybe like a bit undisciplined, or like that people are bringing their own sort of like lives and needs and desires into them without the kind of demands of a like institutional disciplinary context is super important, and they are fragile, and and so finding ways to both think about them deeply and also figure out unsexy questions like sustainability, or kind of like mundane questions like how to sustain them are important. But I'm rambling a bit, but I would say that like I studied architecture, so I think about space, like architects often think about buildings and stuff, and I was never that interested in like the built form. I was interested in the ways that people are kind of like held together, and like I saw that at the time when I was learning architecture, the internet was kind of developing, and so I put those together. And so I guess I am attentive to the ways that like digital networks and the kind of like all the technological development is shaping and transforming kind of institutions and spaces and ways of being together. And so I guess when it comes to a project like this, I continue to maybe that's the first thing that I'm drawn to, is sort of like what are the spaces that we could make that aren't kind of like already determined by just the what's already given. Because now I have a university job. I didn't have a university job for quite a long time. So for me, like I used to think a lot more about adisciplinarity, or like a kind of indifference to discipline, rather than thinking about how to bring them together. Like I just didn't care about disciplines, which is maybe like like we can question the kind of like privilege of being able to do that and everything. But honestly, I was less interested in disciplines than I am now, being a kind of like subject of a university. I have a job, and like these are the things that are circulating. But still, even embedded in all these disciplines, like I think all of us just want to find spaces that are kind of like intellectually a bit kind of like free from some of the like bullshit that's already circulating in those spaces, that kind of like carve away time, or narrow your field of vision and stuff like that. So yeah, with machine listening, I think Joel and James are completely sympathetic with all of that. I don't want to speak for you, but that's the sense I get. And so I think we all wanted to build on that to kind of make the platform of machine listening something that was sort of generous in that way, and kind of that's maybe why the antipathy to like definition maybe that was coming out in the beginning, and you know, being more open rather than closing things down was there. I'm running out of steam. Yeah.
Can I raise one thing?
No,
which
I
is
find,
that
we're also asking a lot of you to be doing a video call for an extended stream, so I do appreciate that.
Well, what do you want to talk about then with the remaining time? Because I was just going to I was going to say something else about this, but it's not necessarily.
There's a couple of things that I did want to raise, but go ahead. This is a bit of, you know.
I might just leave it. I might just leave it.
I just throw in. One circle thing back for me when you were speaking, Sean, was going back to James's invocation of place. You know, and for me, just one way in which I've thought about these in-between spaces is actually borrowed from the French landscapist Gilles Clément, who developed the term third landscape, thinking about the spaces that are neither cultivated nor preserved. And he's written books about what we call weeds, but ruderal species that thrive in kind of so-called pioneer species. And that's a whole other project of mine. But just to say, you know, that I think the earth, you know, or place, and other than human or more than human intelligence is probably crucial to this the question of these spaces we're seeking to nurture and preserve, that was just one thing to say, and the other came, and then I've lost it, the thread at the moment. Oh yeah, it'll come back to me. Anyways, yeah.
Yeah, I think towards the end of that planetization of machine listening piece, there's quite a daunting list, I think, that James offers of things that would have to change in order to fully grapple with the politics of where, you know, these systems are tending towards.
Well, places,
and
almost
part of it would be these kind of things that you're raising.
I mean, place is almost a pole to planet. But the other, I did remember the thing, which was genre, and in poetics, just to throw a tiny bit of poetics in there, you know, I think of poetry as we often it's studied as topos and tropos, you know, the sort of topic and figuration of language. But there's also the placing of, you know, so sorry, type, trope, and tope. So we often think about sort of type. Genre is about the type of work that we're doing, and then we trope and we figure, you know, we manipulate and shape the artifact. But there's the placing of it, which is often left out of Western poetics. You know, in non-Western poetic system, that's very crucial. You know, like where do you deliver the poem? Where do you speak the? Where do you perform? Where do you install the work? You know, with site-based so-called land art, and that was brought into the center of at least artistic practice, you know, in the 20th century. But it's often left out of conversations about poetics. And to me, that's really also crucial for this question of interdisciplinarity is you know, where do you place the work, and then that shapes the question of genre. You know, are you writing an essay in an academic format, or are you writing something that's more that maybe deliberately writing that it's not easily recognizable, and then it's at risk of being overlooked, but it might be like a seed that you throw out into that third landscape, and then eventually germinates, you know, someone someone discovers it.
Yeah, I mean, even part of doing the stream and doing it hybrid is about sort of searching for an alternative to social media, given the direction that it's gone in, and nevertheless the need for us as researchers who are in many cases dispersed in space and time, to come together.
A publishing platform.
Well,
right, that's somehow
also a way that
corporate.
Yeah, I mean, we are on YouTube for this stream. You know, our horizon that we're moving towards is to develop and use a federated streaming infrastructure here at Warwick. But for now, we're still in the corporate stack, at least partly. But maybe that's a segue. There's a couple of things I just wanted to ask before we sort of move to the end. one of them is to do with Sean's work on wake words and the corporate platform deployments of machine listening. Another thing to maybe finish up would be just to ask a little bit about the approaches to artistic research that are also really central to the machine listening platform, and we haven't really spoken about too much. But yeah, Sean, you have this piece that you've written about wake words that I think, yeah, you shared a draft of it. I don't know whether it's coming out now as a...
Well, I think James, I've written a softball piece on wake words, but no one has read it. I think you might be
really?
thinking of James, who's written an actual scholarly piece.
I wrote a piece called "What Wake Words Do," if that's the one you're thinking of, and
Yes,
it's quite long.
Methodologies, what wake words do. Yes, this is another one of
Yeah.
your ones, James. But I'm sure that you're both feeding into like this line.
But it's
of
funny.
research.
Maybe we should answer both these questions at once because it relates to interdisciplinarity and artistic research. Like the only reason I wrote a piece about wake words is because Sean made Sean's work for eavesdropping, which was called "Always Learning," which he would be much better at describing than me, is really focused on the wake word. That it's a real theme, and ever since then I was thinking about the wake word as an object. I was like, well, what if the wake word were what if you wrote an entire piece about the wake word? Like, what if the wake word was a politically, legally, technically significant technology? Right? How would you approach machine listening if you began with the wake word rather than with the smart speakers on it? That all comes from Sean. The planetization essay, I came across some bits and bobs that spiraled off into the artwork, which came first and went in quite a different direction and then came back again. And recently we've been doing improvised performances with bioacoustic data sets using a software instrument that Sean made. So, and we've also attempted to integrate that into lecture, which brings performance lecture, which brings some of the stuff from my essay in. So in other words, we can certainly talk about the wake words piece, but just to acknowledge that it's very fluid in terms of, you know, it's a bit weird even to talk about whose work any of this is. I wrote that piece, but it definitely wouldn't have happened without Sean's original artwork and many of the conversations that happen on our threads. So.
Yeah, which in itself wouldn't have happened without the kind of like curatorial conversations like with Joel and James as well. So yeah, it is kind of funny the way that interdisciplinarity kind of like turns itself over within the production of the works.
Maybe for listeners, you could say what wake word is. We're talking about like, hey Siri, Alexa.
Yeah. So
And,
that's exactly what a wake word is. Hey, the word wake word, the phrase wake word, is really an Amazon branding thing for Alexa. It has a prehistory, but they coin it and they popularize it, and it becomes kind of the term. And that's partly because Alexa is the voice assistant on the first smart speaker, and smart speakers are the first sort of primarily voice operated device. So the interface is voice. You can't really do it any other way. So even though the Siri voice command launches before Alexa and the smart speaker, nobody really uses it. I found the launch video for that generation of the iPhone, and it's like an hour and 45 minutes in. They're like, oh yeah, you can also just say Siri now to turn on your to get it, you know, rather than pressing the button. But that's the premise of Alexa. And I mean, I don't know exactly what the question was other than to talk about it, but I do have a pretty straightforward argument in that piece that maybe hasn't come through strongly enough, which maybe is why it keeps getting turned back at peer review. It's basically that the wake word is politically and legally quite significant, more significant than people realize and quite tied to a specific era in the history of machine listening. So basically, Amazon needs the wake word because after the Snowden, the idea of just everyone bunging smart speakers, listening devices, multiple microphones into their home, and they want you to put it in every room, one in your bedroom, one in your everywhere, is a hot topic. And so the wake word and the specific way, I mean, even the language of the wake word, that it's sleeping, it's inert until it's activated by wake. But of course, it's listening in a certain way. But they invest a lot of energy. We're not listening. We're not listening until the wake word. Don't worry about privacy because the device is not listening until the wake word. Now, they have to do a lot of rhetorical work on the website and explainers and all of the videos that they put out around it to convince people basically that this is, well, yeah, you might have some privacy concerns, but it will only listen when you instruct it to. Don't worry. This is a very kind of liberal idea of consent. You give your consent and the device listens, right? That was politically salient at the time. If you look at the most recent ads for Alexa Plus, which is the agentic AI, generative AI version where you can have they don't even talk about privacy. They're not trying to, no. They say, isn't it amazing how much information you can share with Alexa? You don't even need to activate Alexa. Alexa will start a conversation with you. Alexa knows that you love pizza, that your partner is gluten-free. It can access your documents, your emails, your photos, and your messages. You can now share just about anything with Alexa. That is literally in their most recent ads for Alexa Plus. This is a complete transformation of what it means to engage orally with a device. And so the wake word really recedes in their most recent framing. But I think it was really important at the time in getting all these listening devices into our home, in gathering a lot of data, in initiating, normalizing machine listening, because once the smart speaker's in your home, it can be used to do all sorts of things. Music recognition, you can get it to do, tell you if your baby's crying or if a window is broken and all of these other kinds of things. And so it becomes the wake word is kind of the Trojan horse in a way that gets the smart speaker into our home. When I originally drafted this essay, I had a long section from a performance that Sean did with a piece in the eavesdropping exhibition where he had everybody sit in a circle around these smart speakers and say the wake words. They all had different wake words over and over again. The idea was to open a kind of a portal to the data centers, and it's stuck in my mind for so long because that seems what the wake word does. That's what the wake word is for. The wake word is to open that portal, and it's to convince you that the portal is only open with your consent under the terms that you choose, even though it's much more complicated than that.
Even though it's like quite different now, isn't it? Like now the wake word's a bit of a obstacle, right? Now that you're habituated to when one is habituated to the device, it becomes kind of annoying to have to repeatedly say the wake word. You feel like a bit of a chump.
And also describes the personalization, of which is incredibly problematic. Like I was cycling here trying to let you know that I was going to be late, and I say, "Hey Siri, email Ian," and it would just say, So it's almost inversed. Right, it's like no longer responding to command. It's permanently listening, just letting me know that it's there.
Well, I've always found Alexa and Google Home to be really bad at certain tasks to the point where I just have given up using them for certain things. Like if you ever wanted to get them to search for something specifically, for instance, a video that you wanted to watch, it's funny that you come up against the the boundaries of it still pretty quickly. But yeah, there's a few things.
It's getting better with AI.
Yeah, although there was that moment as well. Just to speak very sort of anecdotally, I was experimenting too with some of OpenAI's machine listening voice interface. I guess they have this system called Whisper. I was using it a little bit to practice language learning. And yeah, I still found it very kind of clunky. I found the pace of it very weird. You can adjust the pace, but then you enter this kind of it's very uncanny valley version of interaction or a space of interaction. But anyway, that aside, yeah, I thought that this paper is really interesting about the wake work because there's several. Yeah, the consent thing it rang true to me because I recalled the way that technology was brought out or that consumer device and some of the anxieties people had post Snowden, but there was also the Google Glass failure, I think, around the same time. And I think you're right that it was really a strategy for the domestication of that device. But you do cover several other things, like the way that it becomes branding, and it's like really an interpolation of the consumer to be continually, in it like a mantra, repeating the name of these brands. And one thing that you didn't emphasize so much in that piece, but maybe people have spoken about it elsewhere, is also what it does to the consumer as a subject in terms of just making commands constantly. It's a real sort of like master-servant, if not even slave kind of relation that is encouraged, and it's, I think, also present with prompting and AI. It's really like a servitude to the user that is designed into the kind of user experience of it. But just to maybe round things off, unless there's other comments.
Just to Wild Connection is just Christina Sharp has this beautiful book called In the Wake, which is about sort of post, the Middle Passage, thinking American literature in the wake of the Middle Passage, but also you could think post-extraction. So just
true. Yeah. No, it's a great
wake is a rich term. Yeah.
But I was also intrigued by the fact that, as you write about, James, in this piece, that Alexa has never made a profit. And then it made me wonder, given it has all these different dimensions to it, how do you see its role within platformization and machine listening, given that it's not directly about profit? It's certainly about speculative capitalism, speculative accumulation. There's a speculative aspect to, I think, a lot of the work that you're exploring in machine listening, but here you really come up against finance, big tech, capital accumulation. But yeah, just it's a bit of an open question. Like,
maybe this is a good point to segue, Sean, towards smart glasses. Our most recent work is all about smart glasses, and we're seeing exactly the same thing at the moment. Meta has poured billions and billions and billions into smart glasses, and then they're constantly saying, they're not really profitable. But on the other hand, they're selling more and more and more than ever. There's a massive like hockey stick curve for smart glasses. Everybody's going in, but then they keep saying that the reality lab is, not turning a profit. So with smart speakers and, voice interfaces and with smart glasses, and which also have voice interfaces, the question of what it means, why they're doing it, and what the profit motive is, and where profitability lies, I think is a really important question. And I have a few thoughts, but Sean, what about you on that one? Because it's something we've talked about quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any really good thoughts. It just seems like it seems to me that it's something that keeps coming up with tech, which is like these like always delayed time frames, or the speculative part is like, of course, part of it, but the way time works and the kind of like time that you'll realize profit just seems like so flexible. And I think of Yeah, I mean, I think you could just say like, oh, it's like vendor lock-in. Like that's one possibility, right? Where you just you pay a lot up front to get a bunch of people locked into your system, and then you start to extort them later. But then also there's that like that Meredith Whittaker text on like the steep cost of capture, which kind of is talking about like how all the big advances in kind of like machine learning, let's say in the 2010s, is built on a kind of a monopolistic control of data, which is, like cost a whole lot of money to be able to do that. And so that's decades, potentially the kind of like the cost of doing business and like just like storing lots and lots of data with no even clear idea of how profit is going to be, gained from that. Just this like ambient sense that this is valuable somehow. It's just like seems like something that is just reoccurring. So yeah, again, not something like specific about where smart speakers will become profitable or how smart glasses will, but it just seems to be this like perennial thing where there's the futurity of it is kind of built in.
Well, isn't that finance capitalist future? I mean, isn't it? I mean, Alexa is the portal to Amazon shopping, right? I mean, I would say,
but not a very good one. So they thought it was going to be much better. They thought they'd be able to do ads on it. Yeah. It hasn't really borne out. So that's those financial streams have been pretty rubbish. So
people can't say like, "Hey Alexa, order me. I need something," and then that doesn't sort of increase.
It seems that they don't make enough money from that to warrant the absolutely billions.
I was thinking like Ryanair as well. When you buy a £20 ticket on Ryanair, it's the shopping that you do in the airport, and they force you through that concourse.
Right.
Well, they also hugely subsidized even the devices to begin with in order to domesticate the take-up. But of course,
that's really the angle that I would take. I would say like it's getting people to live in a world in which Amazon and companies like Amazon are indispensable. Yeah. If you think of it like that, like, well, voice user interfaces will, I think they're going to get much bigger with agentic AI, even if your particular experiences recently have not been so good, and with the rise of smart glasses, I think voice operability is going to be more and more normal. And so this is just in one way, it's just the thin end of the wedge to live in a world in which Amazon has a large share of voice, and for Meta, with smart glasses, they want to own the face as an interface. And they don't know exactly how they'll make money off it, but they feel like if they can own the face, then they'll probably find a way.
Well, I mean, it obviously, it recalls the big debate at the moment about the frontier AI labs and their lack of profitability at the moment and what they're sort of facing in the search for a business model and return on investment. And it makes me think of the historic resonance with speculative finance and capitalism and colonialism and extractivism. The investors want returns. And so it creates a structure where it's speculative, but the direction of travel is towards, that return on investment. So it has this kind of like, at times urgency, like to find profit, like somewhere. And that's always what's going to be, researched. That's what's being explored. That's what the direction of travel is going to be.
To create crisis also, so that,
Yeah, but...
I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I was listening to Novara Media podcast where the guest was saying that that they actually do have a profitable business model, these frontier models. If they were to stop right now, they actually have enough paying clients or subscribers or whatever to to make a profit on the costs. The problem is that they're hurtling forward in competition with a few other players, And so they need to train the next model. And that's where it becomes deeply unprofitable. And where they're spending another order of magnitude more, and so it's like this kind of like arms race dimension to it, where there can only be one winner. Like there's not going to be several competing players. Like it's a battle to the death, and so that drive for profitability has a particular kind of like maybe shape to it in this case.
Yeah, and they have the open models behind them as well. But it's obviously such a complicated situation that there's so much uncertainty, and yet we're all encouraged to also be using those services. I think though, looking at time, I don't know whether there's any final comments or.
I think it's another conversation, but I was really interested in the kind of utopian, collective, artistic practices that offer resistance. And one example I would throw out there is the Sound Tent organization, which is an artist collective based in London, that is part of this streaming community. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a community that's interested in putting microphones around. And Locus Sonus, there's a platform called Locus Sonus. It's a global map. You can go and click on a microphone and just click onto a stream. I mean, some people put them like under bridges or outside their window or in wilderness areas. And it's not recorded, it's not captured. I mean, someone could be capturing it illicitly, but it's a very collective practice. And they do a thing called Reveille once a year. It's around beginning of May. They stream the dawn chorus around the planet, and they have streamers, lined up, and there are curators who shift on. I think it's was it FM? Anyways, the Wave Farm up at upstate New York broadcast it. Resonance FM broadcast it, and the DJs will sort of switch from stream to stream. And then there's a live chat, which is a sort of listeners who chat about what they're hearing. It's very, very collective practice and very generative. People are writing poetry and posting philosophical thought. Anyway, it's an interesting community, and I don't know if you guys are aware. And I'm sort of wondering, we don't have time probably to talk about those, but maybe taught to end on this dystopian note.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you bring them up because I have been in touch with them, maybe about doing a stream as well. I think
Smith,
they're based down in South London, I think, just around the corner from me. So I think they refer to what they do as transmission arts is one term that they use. Rather than machine listening,
human listening as opposed to machine listening. I don't know.
Ian, I don't know whether you've got final thoughts or any comments.
I think not so much. It's just been a really kind of generative conversation that's gotten so many different. That's kind of gone so many different places, and I think like Jonathan, possibly Michael, is trying to find that way of going forward, at least not being in a permanent dystopia, that it could be easy to do. And one of the reasons why I started getting this, I was looking at things like Plord and stuff with an otter with the microphones that were just appearing in other places, and obviously more ubiquitous smart glasses. But it's trying to find that way of just trying to, how do you make something positive?
Yeah, we wanted to do more with the material from this stream itself as a research material, perhaps investigating the transcription platforms using AI and machine listening and performing a sort of audit. I know that in the data set work that you've mentioned, you at least at times think of that as auditing. I'm sure within critical legal studies there's quite a bit to say about auditing. But I think we may have to chat more about this as we do the workshop this afternoon, and maybe off stream. I'll have to stay in touch with both you, Sean, and James, and hopefully Joel as well, about what our next steps would be on this side. And hopefully you can also be involved and communicate to us some of your next steps in the machine listening platform.
Yeah.
You mentioned the smart glasses. I don't know whether you want to give a shout out to what some of the new projects you're working on, or what the next steps will be, just as a way to wrap things up.
I don't. Maybe James, you can think of them in the meantime. But I just want to say that like it was really great to hear about sound tent, and I almost feel like the conversation, in a way, this is like a starting point for it, which is like a lot of times, yeah, we're at the edge, or we maybe are a bit leaning too far into the dystopian and try to find the kind of those sort of like more, I don't want to say positive, but you know, like the point isn't to wallow in dystopianism. And so this conversation is probably like really important for us to the one that seems to be just about to begin. So I do look forward to taking that offline, I guess. But James, do you want to shout out to any projects? Are we working on anything?
We do have a less dystopian project.
Oh yeah, that's
Sean.
right. I forgot about that.
The dataset LARP one. Is that what you were thinking of too?
Well, when I said I forgot about that, yeah.
So there's a guy who does great work, also based in the UK. You may know his name's Connell Parsley. He's got this project called The Future of Good Decision Making or something, which is basically critical legal study. What if critical legal studies in relation to algorithmic culture, I suppose. But the sort of interesting part of his that's interesting. But the more interesting part of his project is that he's really interested in LARP as a method of exploring like decision making with an algorithmic systems, and he's got an expressly and the point is to sort of LARP into being basically regulatory governance processes or review processes that could maybe then be rolled out in various institutions. And we have a project which we've sort of gone a fair way through the development stage of in relation to data set auditing. So like, what would it mean to have a kind of a civil society or a non-technical or a politically oriented, but not necessarily just in terms of is it biased or not, conversation about a data set? Like, what would it mean to build? Who would you need to have in the room? What kind of institutions would you need to put in place? And especially
data sets that are like imagined to be training sort of frontier models, and so that there's a kind of uncertain speculative dimension to the to how they'll even the function that they'll have in society.
Like, what if there was an institute of data sets or something as part of the government? Or would it need to be housed in the government? What does it matter where it's housed? So all of these kinds of questions are part of like the LARP design. We've been pushed to think much more about what LARP is. And obviously it's got this like strange association with the far right and stuff in the moment. But anyway,
I'm not getting
LARPing.
LARP, L-A-R-P?
Yeah.
Okay.
LARP. So
live action role play, yeah.
Role playing.
Okay.
Yeah. LARPing is method.
Sometimes multi-day. Yeah.
Go
Sometimes
ahead.
multi-day role play.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
It's sometimes been used for reenactment, for example, but it's often fantasy.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's certainly speculative, and it is about. I think what I understand, it's interesting to apply to data sets because you're drawing from the fact that a data set is this kind of set of potentials that invite enactment in actualizations in different ways. But LARPing takes you into a kind of post-digital approach. You're not using in a straightforward application the same techniques that might be, applied to a data set. But you could, I imagine you could still enact some of those techniques, but in this different, methodological framework. Yeah, I don't know. I'm intrigued to see how that develops. And also, if you add to your curriculum some good resources for LARPing as a method, that would also be interesting to read.
There is a really good LARP that I can't remember your name, the chap who's off screen.
Jonathan.
Jonathan. Yeah.
Jonathan. That you might be interested given your interests, and it's with somebody who Connell, our collaborator, has collaborated with. It's called the Treaty of Finsbury Park.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
You know that project?
Yeah. Was that a further field project?
Yeah, further field was.
Furtherfield project. Yeah, and so Connell is working with Furtherfield and for the other things that he's doing, and then maybe, and we've spoken with Furtherfield as well about LARP design and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
Check it out. Thanks. Yeah.
Well, should we wrap it up there? It's been a great session. Thanks so much, both of you, for joining us virtually from Australia, from NARM. And yeah, it's been a pleasure. It's a privilege to have you on our stream. Like
Oh, thank you.
It's great to be a part of it. The archive is amazing, and yeah, it's also fun to be kind of experimental subjects of the hybrid form. It went so well.
Thanks for taking that leap of faith.
Yeah,
Thanks so
I'd
much.
like to just say one thing. Not everybody takes the time to engage with our work so carefully, and so it's really a privilege to have been invited to, people who you read the papers and spent time on the website and stuff, and that's really nice. And so I really echo Sean's point about it'd be great to keep the conversation going in some more than cursory way. I don't know exactly what way, but yeah, clearly we have common interests, so.
For sure, yeah, and there are other people here at the institution who would be intersect. I mean, I know Stephen Shapiro works on gaming and probably LARPing in our department, and Nick Lawrence, who you've had on this stream before.
And there may be another opportunity to have Naomi.
Yeah,
as
Naomi
well.
would be great.
There's definitely a network of people. Yeah.
Yeah,
Is Naomi in the YouTube chat?
She is. She's there.
All right. Hi, Naomi.
You should
Hi,
add her
Naomi.
books to
That's
your
very good to
curriculum.
join us.
It's
Nice
very
to see you.
relevant.
And some chatters.
We also didn't get a chance to talk about Jonathan Stern, who also, the late great Jonathan Stern, who contributed to your curriculum, I saw, but that can also be for another time, perhaps. But thanks so much.
to be continued.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks
so
everyone.
much.
Thanks,
Have a great
guys.
day.
Ciao.
Take care. Bye.